1840, the Battle of Ogdensburgh. The British, coming across the frozen St. Lawrence River through deep snow on February 22, 1813, at 7 a.m., surprised the American regulars, militia, and residents, nearly all of whom fled precipitately. Resistance was over by 9 a.m. The attack was contrary to orders of the British commander-in-chief, Sir George Prevost, who arrived at Prescott on the eve of the battle, the last of which swirled about the ruins of Fort Oswegatchie. The opposing forces were quite evenly divided, 500 American regulars and militia, and 480 British regulars and Canadian militia. The report of Lieutenant Colonel Red George MacDonell of the Glengarry Light Infantry, commanding the Eastern District of Upper Canada, to Sir George Prevost said in part, "Under favorable circumstances upon the enemy for his late wanton aggressions on this frontier, I this morning about 7 o'clock crossed the river St. Lawrence upon the ice and attacked and carried, after a little more than an hour's action, his position in and near the opposite town of Ogdensburgh, taking 11 pieces of cannon and all his ordnance, marine, commissariat, and quartermaster general's stores, 4 officers and 70 prisoners, and burning 2 armed schooners and 2 large gunboats, and both his barracks. My force consisted of about 480 regulars and militia, and was divided into 2 columns. The right, commanded by Captain Jenkins of the Glengarry Light Infantry Fencibles, was composed of his own flank company and about 70 militia, and from the state of the ice and the enemy's position in the old French fort, was directed to check his left and interrupt his retreat, whilst I moved on with the left column, consisting of 120 of the King's Regiment, 40 of the Royal Newfoundland Corps, and about 200 militia, toward his position in the town where he had posted his heavy artillery. The depth of the snow in some degree retarded the advance of both columns, and exposed them, particularly the right, to a heavy crossfire from the batteries of the enemy for a longer period than I had expected, but pushing on rapidly after the batteries began to open upon us, the left column soon gained the right bank of the river, under the direct fire of his artillery and line of musketry, posted on an eminence near the shore. Moving on rapidly, my advance, consisting of the detachment of the Royal Newfoundland and some select militia, I turned his right with the detachment of the King's Regiment, and after a few discharges from his artillery, took them with the bayonet, and drove his infantry through the town, some escaping across the black Oswegatchie River into the fort, but the majority fled into the woods, or sought refuge in the houses, from whence they kept up such a galling fire that it was necessary to dislodge them with our field pieces, which now came up from the bank of the river, where they had stuck on the landing in the deep snow. Having gained the high ground on the brink of the Black River opposite the fort, I prepared to carry it by storm, but the men being quite exhausted, I procured time for them to recover breath by sending in a summons requiring an unconditional surrender. During these transactions, Captain Jenkins had gallantly led his column and had been exposed to a heavy fire of 7 guns, which he bravely attempted to take with the bayonet, though covered with 200 of the enemy's best troops, advancing as rapidly as the deep snow and the exhausted state in consequence of his men would admit. He ordered a charge and had not proceeded many paces when his left arm was broken to pieces by grape shot. But still undauntedly running on with his men, he almost immediately afterward was deprived of the use of his right arm by a discharge of case shot. Still heroically disregarding all personal consideration, he nobly ran on, cheering his men, to the assault, till, exhausted by pain and loss of blood, he became unable to move. His company gallantly continued the charge under Lieutenant Macaulay, but the reserve of militia not being able to keep up with them, they were compelled by the great superiority of the enemy to give way, leaving a few on a commanding position, and a few of the most advanced in the enemy's possession, nearly about the time that I gained the height above mentioned. The enemy hesitating to surrender, I instantly carried his eastern battery, and by it silenced another which now opened again, and ordering on the advance the detachment of the King's and the Highland Company of Militia, under Captain Eustace of the King's Regiment, he gallantly rushed into the fort, but the enemy, retreating by the opposite entrance, escaped into the woods, which I should effectually have prevented if my Indian warriors had returned sooner from a detached service on which they that morning had been employed. I cannot close this statement without expressing my admiration for the gallantry and self-devotion of Captain Jenkins, who has lost one arm and is in danger of losing the other. I must also report the intrepidity of Captain Leveille of the Newfoundland Regiment, who had the immediate charge of the militia under Colonel Fraser, of Captain Eustace and the other officers of the King's Regiment, and particularly of Lieutenant Ridge of that corps, who very gallantly led on the advance, and of Lieutenant Macaulay and Ensign MacDonald of the Glengarry Regiment, as also Lieutenant Gangbun of the Royal Engineers, and Ensign Mackay of the Glengarry Light Infantry, and of Ensign Kerr of the militia, each of whom had charge of a field piece, and of Lieutenant Impey of the militia, who had lost a leg. I was also well supported by Colonel Fraser and the other officers and men of the militia, who emulated the conspicuous bravery of all the troops of the line. I enclose a list of the killed and wounded. Return of the killed and wounded in the action of 22nd February 1813. Total loss: 1 sergeant, 7 rank and file killed, 1 field officer, 2 captains, 5 subalterns, 4 sergeants, 40 rank and file wounded. The enemy had 500 men under arms and must have sustained a considerable loss. The account was signed by Colonel MacDonald and his military secretary, Noah Freer. The British Colonial Department, Downing Street, London, on June 2, 1814, issued the following report of the battle. Sir George Prevost, in a dispatch dated Niagara, 27 February 1813, acquainted Lord Bathurst, Secretary of State for the Department of War and the Colonies, that on the 21st of February he arrived at Prescott within a mile of the enemy posted at Ogdensburgh, who had availed themselves of the frozen state of the St. Lawrence River, that neighborhood, to carry on repeated nocturnal enterprises against posts of communication which were occupied by the militia, and to commit frequent depredations upon the persons and property of His Majesty's subjects, carefully selecting objects beyond the immediate support and protection of a regular military force. In order to put a stop to these depredations, Sir George deemed it necessary to dislodge the enemy from his position at Ogdensburgh, which was effected in a very spirited manner by a detachment under the command of Major MacDonald, whose report Sir George encloses. Sir George praises the gallant conduct of Captain Jenkins of the Glengarry Fencibles and Lieutenant Impey of the Dundas Militia, the former of whom lost an arm and the latter a leg. Sir George warmly recommends them both for promotion. The official American account of the battle was brief. Captain Forsyth, in a dispatch to the Secretary of War, said, "Sir, I have only time to inform you that the enemy, with a very superior force, succeeded in taking Ogdensburgh this morning about 9. They had 2 men to our 1, exclusive of Indians. Numbers of the enemy are dead on the field. Not more than 20 of our men were and wounded. Lieutenant Beard is among the latter. I have made a saving retreat of about 8 or 9 miles. I could not get all the wounded off. We have killed 2 of the enemy to 1 of ours killed by them. We want ammunition and some provisions sent to us, also sleighs for the wounded. If you can send me 300 men, all shall be retaken, and Prescott too, or I will lose my life in the attempt. I shall write more particulars today." Forsyth did not get the help he so urgently requested, and with his men proceeded to Sackett's Harbor. The British regulars and militia returned to Prescott.